The story of Boris and the Dark Survival, its timeline, ending, its relationship with Bendy and the Dark Revival, and most importantly, its relationship with Bendy and the Ink Machine. So without wasting any more time, let's discuss them all. Okay, so when Boris and the Dark Survival trailer dropped, it said, and I quote, "Before the Dark Revival begins," basically telling us or giving us hints that this could be a prequel to Bendy the Dark Revival, like Boris getting to the studio before Audrey, who's basically the main character in the Bendy and the Dark Revival. But Boris and the Dark Survival is a top-down survival horror game where you go around Joey Drew Studios' actual studio, by the way, and learn secrets and mysteries of the past, whilst an ink demon roaming around in the darkness of the inky shadows, the abyss of Joey Drew Studios. Now, that was more than enough for me to play on my own, but Kindly Beast, especially Matt Goals and Measley, they went way too far because they added more than that. While you're searching the studio, you have to collect supplies and gears, as well as maintain, listen to this, your stamina bar by getting soups around the studio. It helps you run and keep you away from the ink demon. Moreover, and this thing is actually what made this game addictive in the first place, is the layout of the studio. The layout of the map is divided into days and levels, upping the difficulty and layout of the whole game. And guess what? Each time you play, you don't get day 1, level 1, day 2, level 2. No, it is completely random. Yes, layout and difficulty is random. You never know what part of the studio you're gonna get, what kind of layout you're gonna get. Hence, when you do beat the level, the satisfaction feeling is just another level because the game gave you challenge and you completed it. So of course you're gonna get that satisfaction feeling, that good stuff feeling. Also, Mike Mood confirmed that the game was made up from the ground. All textures were redesigned alongside Bendy and Boris 3D model. Not to mention the beginning intro scene and the ending cutscene were amazingly drawn, and not to mention the soundtrack. I've uploaded the video yesterday, by the way, all day before that. So with all the context and review out of the way, let's discuss the story part of the game, where this game fits into the timeline. What is this game even all about, and what is that ending? Boris and the Dark Survival is a story about Boris, of course, a longtime companion of the main character of the first game, Bendy and the Ink Machine. Boris is actually one of the favorite, if not the favorite character in Bendy franchise, and loved massively by the fans. Now, on Steam, it said, and I quote, "Play as Boris the Wolf, the cartoon companion of Bendy, as you hunt throughout the abandoned cartoon studio for the supplies Boris needs to keep going. You're not alone. The monstrous ink demon stalks you at every turn. Beware the sound of his beating heart as he creeps up from behind and catches you in his tripping gaze. Nowhere is safe, yet secret lies in wait for those adventurous enough to seek them out." This confirms specifically that Boris did came here for a reason. It's not like he magically ended up in the studio and was like, well, might as well roam around the studio, and we will come to that in just a second. What's also interesting is that apart from Bendy and Boris, there's no one else in the studio. Of course, it's a small game, it is specifically for Boris' part and to hype up Bendy the Dark Revival. Bendy the Dark Revival is of course not a sequel or prequel, which is interesting for this game because they said in the trailer before the Dark Revival begins, so automatically everyone would assume that it's before Bendy and the Dark Revival story begins, right? Well, kinda yes. Let's talk about it. In order to really understand what I'm trying to say here, let's get to the first game, Bendy and the Ink Machine, where we saw Henry, who was a longtime friend of the studio owner, Joey Drew Studios, who was called by Joey himself after 30 years, which was already shady enough to begin with. Chapter 5 of Bendy and the Ink Machine was jaw-dropping, not just gameplay-wise, but story-wise as well, because it came crushing down hard. Was it beginning when he met Joey? What happened to Henry in Chapter 5? Although it was answered, it definitely didn't close the book overall for Henry. Hence, that led to Bendy and the Dark Revival. So really, Mike Mood saying that the new game coming up is not a prequel or a sequel is really fascinating and smart. Why? Because remember, this is a huge studio. There isn't a single story of the first game. Actually, let me rephrase that. There isn't a single story in the studio. There are multiple characters. What happened to Allison, Tom, Bertram, and so many lost souls. There are many of the stories that happened in the studio that has yet to be unfolded. Henry just happened to be forefront of the story we played and experienced. Well, from the first day Bendy the Dark Revival was announced, I've been saying that it's the same timeline, different perspective of the same story of different characters, which is why this game need not to be sequel or prequel, because whilst Henry's story was happening, others were suffering as well. Remember how in Bendy and the Ink Machine, whilst Henry was doing his thing, there were other stuff happening that we had no control over, but were happening in the parts of the studio anyway. Just like Boris and the Dark Survival, we see only one side of the studio, one part of the story, Boris Story. You get me now? And speaking of which, now, in order to understand the ending, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of the game, the intro cutscene, how it all started. Take a look. Now it is interesting because we learned from the first game that Henry wasn't the only one who was invited back to the studio by Joey. He wanted to bring his creations to life, literally. And after Bendy, Boris was the most popular. Not even Alice Angel was close to Boris' popularity. Now this clip confirms that he did got back, but not in a way he thought he would see his past. Hence, living in a dangerous world comes in, which actually makes sense because Boris' character in-game, cartoon-wise, has lost everything except one, his goofy personality. He can't talk, he's scared, but he likes soup, which is why after becoming inky creature he had no way out. He couldn't get out, hence finding whatever he can to survive. Supplies, in other words. We knew that part because when we met Boris in Chapter 2, he was already familiar with the entire studio. He knew where to go, what to do, where Bendy would be, hence he knew exactly where to hide. Now, there was a specific moment after Boris was stuck in the studio and right before Henry entered the studio in the first game. This happened in that moment in the Boris and the Dark Survival Ending. This ending, and the only ending, can be achieved by finding 7 scrap papers to form a collage in Boris's safe room. These can be found by searching the studio and going to extreme lengths, taking risks, and finding those lockers. Now at first it didn't make much sense, but these are the clues to put 2 and 2 together. Boris suddenly realizes who he was. It's not that, hey, Boris was Henry. No, Boris saw the collage and remembered his past, who he used to be, how he was before inky stuff for a brief moment of time. He saw himself almost back in time before everything happened, but then it was gone, and then you hear this. This is the exact sound that we hear in both chapters 1 and 5 of Bendy and the Ink Machine, the first game in the franchise. This sound effect is when Henry, after meeting Joey in his apartment or home and seeing his letter, came to the studio on Joey's request to see what he has in store for him. That is where Henry's story begins and Boris's ends momentarily. Of course, we all know what happened to him in Chapter 4. Poor Boris, by the way. So now that the timeline got super interested because the ending makes it solid candidate for a prequel of Bendy and the Ink Machine. Yes, I'm saying it here. Boris and the Dark Survival is a prequel to both Bendy and the Ink Machine and Bendy and the Dark Survival. But the trailer said before Bendy and the Dark Revival, so what's really going on here? Simple. Like I mentioned earlier, Bendy and the Dark Revival does not need to be prequel or sequel. It's different story in the same timeline. Hence, Bendy and the Ink Machine and Bendy and the Dark Revival are one part of the same timeline. But Boris and the Dark Survival comes before both, setting up the scene for both Henry and guess what? Audrey. And now we know that Henry is stuck in the loop by learning from Chapter 5, going through that over and over again. And now everything is interesting. Why, you may ask? Because in the Bendy and the Dark Revival, Audrey is the main character, and Audrey could be the one to end that loop, finishing whatever started by the Joey Drew himself in Joey Drew Studios setting up Bendy and Ink Machine 2 for 2021. Who knows? But one thing I do know for a fact that unlike Henry or Boris, Audrey has more power, more to her plate than both Henry and Boris. Heck, even Alice Angel. We know Alice Angel will be with us, and we know that their story is different from Henry, but they all part of the same Joey Drew Studios. So we will get to see different story from a different perspective of the same timeline in the same studio. That is my bold prediction for Bendy the Dark Revival 2020, coming this year by the way. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here, because there's still a lot left, like audio tapes from Boris and the Dark Survival that confirms the theories, so we will save that for later. And there's so much other stuff that I need to get into, but I would have to end this video right here, right now. I know you guys don't like the Bendy content that I do on the channel. Some of you does. I do these sort of stuff every now and then to really get out of Dark Deception sometimes, see other games, and then come back with a fresh mindset so that I could give different inputs for Dark Deception so we can all enjoy and have different type of content on the channel. You know, it's fine. It's just how YouTube works. But anyways, 25k coming soon. We need to get there really soon. And watch this video right here. It's really interesting. And let the outro plays for itself.